at the JEF Secretariat.
Thank you, Juha, and thanks to the IEO for really putting forward, I think, the most comprehensive analysis of the JEF portfolio on protected areas ever conducted. I want to compliment them as well as UNDP, which were part of this assessment, Aaron and the team that worked for a couple of years on a very comprehensive depiction of where JEF has gone into Kyoto protected areas. I would dare to say that if the JEF were to close its doors today, I think the longest lasting legacy that we would have left in terms of impact around the world would be protected areas in biodiversity conservation. Not to mean that we haven't done a lot in pioneering technologies on renewable energy efficiency, climate change.
Button when you have power.
Sorry?
It says that where you press the thing, it said power off. It says, please press a certain button, but I couldn't read it.
Okay.
Now look at the bottom right there.
But we don't want
Press it again.
Press it again.
Yeah.
I think it was.
So going back to protected areas, really what would have represented a significant impact of JEF presence around the world. We did an analysis looking at the global need across a series of dimensions of the work that we do with the GEF when we were putting together the JEF 2020 strategy, as we call it. And again, we estimate that JEF has been responsible for 20% of the target that was put forward in Aichi Target 11 for the Convention on Biodiversity to have 17% of the global surface of the planet with protected status. So that's a tremendous footprint around the world. And again, it wouldn't have happened without the 24, 25 years of work for the JEF in this area. The other message that emerges, I think, very strongly is that, despite commentaries to the contrary, protected areas are still a very important and very effective tool for conservation and also for a number of additional spillover benefits that we find for livelihoods, for protection of ecosystem services, and so forth. I also found quite interestingly that the finding that 58% of the protected areas that JEF has invested span key biodiversity areas, which again are high priorities for biodiversity globally. And also another 31% have some international designations that were assigned by organizations and standards around the world. I'd like to comment on this particular one because it would be a rather strange accident that without actively looking at this agenda globally, 60%, close to 60% of all investments were in key biodiversity areas. But if you look at how the system of allocating resources of the JEF for biodiversity actually works, it's primarily driven by the presence and density of threatened species globally. And of course, key biodiversity areas are areas that protect habitat of globally threatened biodiversity. So in a sense, this result is not to be unexpected. I find it quite interesting that it turned out to be that way. I also found very, I also found that JEF recipient countries have really improved the management effectiveness of protected areas, as the findings have shown, which has been revealed to reduce pressures on biodiversity at the protected site level, positive trends in species populations, as Aaron has shown, conserved and impact areas in the JEF supported protected areas. And in many instances, we also found more stable, more reliable, and robust funding streams to support protected area management costs. The evidence from the evaluation also validates our current biodiversity strategy of improving management effectiveness of protected areas and protected area systems based on a clear theory of change that states that improving the management effectiveness of individual protected areas and of protected area systems, which is our focus at the moment, is best achieved through a combination of building institutional capacity, improving financial sustainability of the system as a whole, and ensuring ecological representation, along with concentrated site-based support and active community engagement. I think it was Woody Allen who used to say that 80% of success is just showing up, and I think that Jeff has been showing up quite regularly in our client countries on the protected areas agenda for nearly 2 decades. And the Mexico example is quite emblematic, in which the evaluation office found that Jeff-supported protected areas had 23% less deforestation when compared with others not receiving Jeff support, and that this support has led to a strengthened protected area agency that built political support for protected areas in the national government. So CONAMP budget increased 20 times from 1994, when we started working there, to 2003. This was the result of an investment package of 20 projects totaling $192 million of protected areas in Mexico, which has been more than any one country in the JEF portfolio. And if you go to Mexico, if you talk to people in CONAMP, they will say that the JEF was actually the father or the mother, if you want to describe that way, of that particular agency. And we are seeing similar results happening elsewhere. I see Meg Smighton here. She is leading on the WWF side, the ARPA project, which is reputedly the largest forest conservation project in the world, based on protected areas. The JEF has been with support for now entering the 3rd phase of that project, together with the World Bank, the German government, the Brazilian government, and other funders. And it's now addressing actually the recommendation, one of the recommendations that comes from the evaluation, which is to address the financial sustainability of the system. How many new protected areas did the ARPA created? We have $60 million.
25 million hectares.
So yeah.
I'm not sure how many areas that was.
Right. So ARPA has a target of 60 million hectares of areas that are supported by the program, but out of that, about 25 are new to the system. And the whole challenge is, how do you support that investment? How do you ensure that this legacy perpetuates in the future against a growing threat coming from development, from infrastructure coming in, regional integration, and so forth. And on that aspect, there is a new funding mechanism that has been established. It's called the ARPA for Life Transition Fund, which over a period of 25 years has been capitalized with about $200 million, a little more than that, will progressively transfer the return cost of managing protected areas to the government budget of Brazil, both at the federal and state level, while this fund dries up as a sinking fund over that period of time. So we're starting to experiment with how we sustain the investment has been done through the JEF and through countries over time. I would say that one of the things that impressed me most is really the success of this investment, against a series of different contexts. And Aaron mentioned some places that are really hard to work, and some places that are not faring as well as others. But for the most part, this has been a tremendous investment overall. One of the aspects that, although it's mentioned tangentially in one of the recommendations, is I would have liked to see more treatment, was the fact that all this work has been done through a period of 2 decades in which climate change has become more important over time. And so we need to start introducing climate change consideration in the design and investments that we make, not only to make these systems more resilient, but also to recognize that these series of protected areas in a larger landscape really represent the backbone of a system that supports biodiversity across the board. So it's not only about protecting species that are under immediate threat, but also making sure that biodiversity that exists in the larger landscape are also the target of the work that we do on mainstreaming biodiversity and making sure that happens. There was also, Aaron and you, a bit of a split mind here on the recommendation about how do we ensure that we have better information on JAF protected areas, meaning where are these protected areas, what they are protecting, and time frame that they are operating on. Well, at the same time, you ask for less burden on the project executors in terms of looking at supporting and reporting on data. And the suggestion is perhaps technologies such as remote sensing can address that aspect. That's probably part of it, but I don't think it will replace, because you look at the limitations that you found trying to look, for example, at the impact of protected areas on wildlife population trends. That evidence was quite feeble in terms of making sure that we understand that connection. So I think that the need to really have those that are implementing, executing protected area projects on the ground to be much more forthcoming in collecting the needed data so that we can learn from this body of evidence, I think is going to be more important over time. I just asking Janine on the side, I was looking at this map of the dotted map, and there's a big gap on northern Amazon in Brazil where we have all the protected areas from the ARPA project. I don't know if they were accounted in your assessment or not, but that's one of the largest, but probably comparable, if not larger than the work that's been done in Mexico. So I think it's also important to track. So I will not take more of your time. I mean, again, it was a tremendous effort. I think the report is going to be tremendously useful well into the future. And I hope that you can revisit some of the gaps that haven't been addressed at this point once we have more solid data on these aspects that you're not able to do it now because of information limitations. But I congratulate you, Guy. I think it's one of the best, if not the best product you have produced on, again, something that is probably one of the largest legacies of the job. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo, and thanks for the kind words also. So let's move to Nigel Sizer from World Resources Institute.
Thank you, Juha. Thank you, Aaron. It's nice to be here and to see some old friends I haven't seen for a few years. I'm not quite sure why I was invited. I'm not an expert on protected areas or protected area management effectiveness. So I will just share some sort of general observations and somewhat random comments perhaps on this. First of all, I want to echo everything that Gustavo said and particularly highlight the significance of this evaluation itself. Not all of you may be aware that, I mean, even among the big NGOs, the largest groups investing the most on this kind of work outside of GEF, there is virtually no systematic effort, even effort to try to measure effectiveness of that work. So while you've got a number of limitations with the information here and this analysis, and I'll come on to some of those, this is truly outstanding work, and I really congratulate the GEF, the evaluation unit, simply for the fact of existing, as Woody Allen said. That is a great achievement. It's virtually unique, and we desperately need more of this kind of analysis, independent or otherwise, of the effectiveness of investment in efforts to improve the management of natural resources. The sad fact of the matter is that while the proportion of the planet that's covered by protected areas has very dramatically increased over the last generation, loss of biodiversity also continues to accelerate. If you look at the 80 targets, not one of them really is on track to meet the target. At the last CPD conference of the parties, Braulio Diaz, the executive secretary, suggested that one of those targets might actually be met, which I think is the one related to protected area coverage. But then, of course, that immediately begs the question about the effectiveness of those protected areas and what those numbers really mean. So we really are dealing with a very, very serious situation, and I think interest in biodiversity is going to skyrocket over the coming decades. as it has with climate change, and as the science becomes clearer about the connections between, the highly complex connections between biodiversity and human well-being and the economy. At the same time, I think we're going to see very significant pushback within very significant countries on these efforts as land becomes scarce, and particularly as the struggle for expansion of production of major agricultural commodities to simply feed people is going to increase. We are doing a lot of work in Indonesia, and I was there last week, and you see that incredibly dramatically there right now, where you have some of the biggest players in the agricultural commodity sector and a number of leaders in government saying, we want to have zero deforestation supply chains, we want to manage these landscapes very carefully, we want to meet the aspirations of global markets, and that's now hit head-on a governmental attack from other interests in the government, and the other chunk of business which is just declared voluntary set-asides of areas by companies illegal, and is pushing back very, very hard on these efforts. And there's a risk of seeing similar dynamics in many, many other countries as these interests start to literally confront each other on the ground across these landscapes as resources become more and more scarce. So the importance of this work is incredibly high, and I think the GEF is working hard and I think struggling, as we all are, to figure out how we understand what we're doing in protected areas in the wider context, the wider landscapes, and the broader context of governance, politics, and institutional development. What are the most effective allocations of these types of resources faced with these kinds of threats? How much more do we invest in sort of the nitty-gritty management effectiveness type work that you're talking about within protected areas versus, assuming there's limited resources, versus moving upstream to engaging more on the political processes and the basic understanding of the role of improved landscape management to the economy. There's still an assumption, I think, for the vast majority of the politicians who govern these systems in these countries that, as you said, in the case of Mexico, if the economy is declining, well, we don't need to continue to fund the protected areas so much because that's not going to help us get out of this mess. When, of course, it's exactly the opposite. But that case hasn't been made. It's not being made effectively. What is GEF's role in making that case and engaging more in those debates? Some interesting questions, I think, emerge, and perhaps they covered in the full report. I didn't quite read all 200 pages of it, but I hope I will. A few interesting things. So you highlight good governance as a key part of that. I think it'd be very interesting to unpack that a little bit and understand which aspects of governance are most significant, and also which aspects of what you call effective management. Are there some aspects of that, particularly when you did your field visits and so on, that struck you as being far more important than others? Again, thinking about what we need to be investing in and what we can influence, particularly on the governance side. Aaron, you made an interesting comment when you were presenting this. You talked rightly about the fundamental role that government has in managing these protected area systems. There's a whole other side to protected areas management, which is traditional community, indigenous people, and so on, and the whole story around land rights and biodiversity. So using similar types of data sets to the ones that you were using, but based on remote sensing, which are very limited, and we'll come to that in a moment. However, we did some analysis last year with Rights and Resources International, which highlighted the very, very positive story around traditional land rights. Where traditional land rights are recognized, you see a strikingly higher level of tree cover maintenance or reduced tree cover loss using exactly the same Hansen data. How does that compare with the more traditional systems led by governments? It'd be very interesting to unpack that a little bit more. see where that's going. Another interesting question, and this has been quite a live issue in Congress over the last few years in relation to the work that USAID is funding in Central Africa, is the issue of sort of more traditional enforcement approaches. Is it better, there's members of Congress who are real fans of buying guns for enforcement agencies in Central Africa and places like Gabon and so on. They've actually reduced funding for the type of work that probably most of us are more comfortable with and more familiar with, of engagement and consensus building and constituency building and capacity building and so on, without the guns so much. And however, the jury seems to be out on what's most effective. And so I think looking at some of that data, and particularly as the pressure grows on some of these areas, the harsh reality is that there might be a case for what they're saying in some context. So how do we juggle that in the context of GEF's work? Finally, just commenting on the data and the quality of the information, which is something, the part of this that we do know maybe a little bit about, because of our work with Global Forest Watch, which is working very intensively with the World Database on Protected Areas, WCMC, and others to look at some of these questions as well. So, fundamental question is, do we really actually know what's happening across the board with these areas? How robust are the findings of the analysis? And you notice some of the striking gaps in the data. Only less than half of the projects were actually, wow, that really begs a lot of questions. But Gustavo's clearly onto that, so that's great. The World Database on Protected Areas. Is there anyone here from WCMC or WDPA before I talk about them?
They might be
They might be on the line. The clouds.
Okay, I'm gonna point out some things, but then I'm gonna say something that I think they'll like. So we have some interesting dynamics with them with Global Forest Watch right now. We've incorporated their database into Global Forest Watch. It's 200,000 protected areas globally. The WDPA has virtually no funding. So we're all drawing upon those data sets. They have less than $1 million a year budget to maintain that database of 200,000 protected areas. They've done an absolutely heroic job of greatly improving it over the last few years. Most of the funding is actually coming from industry who are subscribing to the system. And that, as a result of that, there are actually restrictions in how the data can be used. So we can't actually sub-license you to download the data of WDPA through the Global Forest Watch system. We have to direct you back to WDPA, which is okay, but it gets complicated. It's harder to access and raises some questions. So there's just fundamental questions, and I think to GEF and your friends in the donor community, just looking at some of the basic, really basic maintenance of these databases that we depend upon here is just crying out for attention. You're talking $1, $2, $3 million a year to transform the maintenance of the WDPA database, which has no institutional allocation of funding to it from the UN system, even though it sits within that system. Another obvious challenge here is that you were very restricted to, it looked like, to the tree cover work of Hansen and UMD in terms of the sort of a global analysis, and we're very aware that there are very few globally consistent databases with time series that can be used. So that database is truly exceptional. Protected areas go far beyond trees to wetlands, grasslands, shrublands, and other things that we can't monitor with those systems, and it's going to be some time before we are able to, although that will come. And it also misses the cryptic impacts on these landscapes. So what's happening to the faunal populations, the hunting pressure and so on, communities around protected areas, using those as their hunting grounds and the empty forests, empty landscapes. We know is absolutely pervasive. There's some horrific data coming out of the Brazilian Amazon, Carlos Perez's work on that we're very familiar with. So some striking gaps in the information that lead us, I think, to very dramatically, potentially understate the seriousness of the situation. With that, I'll stop, and hopefully that provokes some discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nigel. And it has, and we already have a question for you online, but we'll come to that later. You you want to react to anything very quickly?
Very, very quickly. Yes, I agree with Gustavo that technology cannot fully replace. But at the same time, our proposal would be focus on the what, where, and when, and not on the other stuff. The other stuff is very secondary. If you have those three things, we can do a lot actually. That was the biggest limitation of this evaluation. So it's not adding more, but forget about the other stuff. Focus on this as a priority. Brazil, actually, yes, you have mentioned this before, in fact, a couple of times. And actually, the problem is that the way the map works is that it doesn't put it in the Northeast, but it's in Brazil. So we are considering it. It just doesn't have it located geographically in the part of Brazil, but somewhere in Brazil. So indeed, it is being accounted. And what do we think?
Apply for the Congo Basin, by the way.
Yeah, no, but we have Brazil. I know we have for sure. That is because we did go back and look at it. We posted that. And on governance, yes, on the issue of law enforcement vis-a-vis hearts and minds type of thing. The truth is that the right mix of both approaches will vary from case to case, and you have to be realistic. If we're finding increasing problems with drug trafficking in Central America affecting protected areas. The elephants problem, the rhinos problem, those are not hearts and mind battles. And we have to be realistic about that, basically. So we have to. There's no one solution there. We have to see what's happening in there. And on the data, the WDPA, they actually were very generous with us. They collaborated with both, giving us the access to the 200,000 protected areas, but also the KPAs. Yes, one of our recommendations goes about GF having a bigger role in global public goods information. And yes, GF is well positioned, even though within the system is not perceived as being that indeed. It's one of the best things to move. It's difficult because of the history, but I'm sure Gustavo appreciates the value, but it's not as easy to move, and we push in that direction too. And limitations on the Hansen data set, yes, completely agree, both of you. Indeed, we basically, when we're talking about forests, we started with 30% coverage. Okay? Otherwise, you can really not. So there's a lot of other ecosystems that are not being covered. But also, we tried to mitigate that there by going to the field. We did not just do forests. We went to the field, 28 protected areas. Of course, it's not the same, but it's quite big compared to other evaluations in terms of field presence, understanding all factors. And a lot of literature research. We really looked at a lot of things that have been published. But still, the problem is there.
Okay, thanks very much.